Hi everyone, the Panoptical poet here. I just thought I'd read you a few poems. So I'm recording this in my backyard in Castlegar, but I used to live in Prince George, and when I lived in Prince George, I used to live on a street on the corner of two streets, and the intersecting signs made a cross, and it said Bird Quadrant, and that always kind of struck me, and that's where this came from. I live on Bird Quadrant. I live on Bird Quadrant. But it is not the intersecting street signs at the end of my block that tells me this. It is the morning's orchestra, the notes of Mother Nature's tongue incited by the fresh rays of sun that warm a song out of the feathered philharmonic of my otherwise quiet neighborhood. This is serenity, this solitary moment nestled into the frenzy of trills that overlap one another as crinoline overlaps itself in the skirt of a ballerina. So I'm not a huge sci-fi fan, but I do get into some sci-fi shows once in a while. I definitely have a weakness for the DC superhero shows, and I have a couple poems coming out in a anthology of sci-fi poetry by Dimensionfold Press, and that's called Eccentric Orbits is the name of the anthology. And one of the poems I have in there is called The Flash, which is based on my knowledge of the Flash from comic books and the DC show. But the other one that's coming out in there is also called the Cylon poem. And I think people are probably a little bit less familiar with Battlestar Galactica unless you're like a real sci-fi person. So Battlestar Galactica was made, I want to say in the 60s, but it was also remade again in the 90s. And I watched the 90s version, and it inspired a poem called the Cylon poem. I'm going to read that for you now. So the Cylon poem. To know the face of God is to know madness, said one little god to another. But what is God really? Do you find it in the space between life and death? Does it all really mean more because of death and that tiny space? What does it mean to breathe, to inhale these ephemeral experiences that continue to add to one another through the process of choice until they add up to a life? What is right and wrong if everything is determined or undetermined by simply going right or left? But is choice an illusion? One little god spoke softly. If this has happened before, and it will all happen again. Enantiodromia. I often have to think about how old I am. It seems I am trying to forget, in an effort to forget how many years have passed me by, like signs on a highway that barely get the time to be read before headlights flash over them and they are gone. Is time really relevant in any more than a perceptual capacity anyway? Or does it run like the river behind my house, in a constant cycle where motion is the only thing that matters? Not where you're going or how you get there, just the simple fact that you continually moved forward. Like the river does, I remain relatively the same, even in motion. A few of my forehead lines cutting slightly deeper in the same way a current cuts a bank, leaving the marks of moments where it has passed. But all of those lines will eventually be washed away, with the remnants of my body, and with this river, leaving only the flow of eternal energy that even enantiodromia cannot erode.